Welcome, Enrique and Michelle. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia. Hi, Michelle. Really nice seeing you today. I really had a nice time reading your book, Long Life Learning, and it was very, very thought-provoking, particularly for an academic like me. I've been in academia for 31 years right now, so I found a lot of very interesting anchor points. So, really, really intrigued to see how do you start introducing your book and the ideas on it.
Thank you so much, Enrique. It's so good to be here with you and the audience. I thought it might be helpful before we jump into talking about the insights from the book for you and the audience to be able to hear from the learners themselves. And so I wanted to just sort of start with a short video and then we can jump into a conversation.
Sounds great.
I could learn to do most jobs, but I understand the reality of the job market is you have to come in saying, I already know how to do this. No one's going to give you 6 months to figure out how to do a job.
I was laid off, and for the first time, the relevance of not having a degree became manifest because even though I had years upon years, over 20 years of experience doing all these different things, the first question they were asking is, so where'd you go to school? The last time I actually had to go looking for a job, we did things like talk to people face to face, and that's completely gone now. And you just end up getting put into a slot, and as a result, they don't know who you are. They just look at, has he gone to school? No, so then you go into that pile.
Because you don't learn how to finance. When you're poor. So you don't learn how to you almost ignore your finances. And I had to learn to look at them to be able to manage them. But that's a huge, overwhelming gap.
But I knew that in order to make a livable wage, at the time I think they were paying me like a little over minimum wage, which you can't live on if you wanted to. I needed to put something in front of my name or behind my name to, one, separate myself from being a criminal and also to make me legitimate in some ways.
Generally, my routine was I didn't have a car at the time. I was riding a bicycle, and I would put my children on the school bus for school and ride my bike and clean houses for the doctors and the dentists down in the high-end neighborhoods, and then ride my bike up to school and I'd audio tape my classes and ride home and meet the kids. And then let them play and cook dinner and do all those preparatory things that you do with children. And after they're bathed and they're sitting there, watching TV or relaxing before bed, I'd put my headsets, listen to my lecture again, and I'd be sewing wedding dresses at this long table that I had, and I would just be sewing dresses and listening to the lecture. On the weekends, I was driving a taxi.
I mean, when I went to orientation, it was crazy. It was overwhelming. I saw all these young people, sitting next to me, and I was like, I do not belong here. What am I doing? These are kids that are coming out of high school, and I can be their mother. That's what I'm going to be in the classroom, and I really don't want to be that. Plus, I have experience. I have experience. I don't have a paper that can show that I have knowledge.
I can say yes or no. Have you ever been convicted? That question on the application, the box, right?
Yeah.
So that question comes up, so I'm just like, how am I supposed to succeed? And everything keeps you stuck. You can only do so much. They want me to work doing construction, mindless work, but that's not me. I can work with my hands, but my mind is not being fed. My mind needs to be fed for me to feel like I'm encouraged, like I'm involved in something.
People are working hard. People are working so hard, and people don't have opportunities that other people have. And it doesn't mean they're not smart.
It felt like punishment, just to try to get ahead. I have this go, get it spirit, but I was never in a position or given that supportive hope to keep going forward. You know what I mean? And I knew that's where I wanted to go, was forward.
You know, the Greek word to incite means to put a flame underneath. And I want to incite some learning as well as some dreaming.
Extremely interesting, Michelle. Very, very interesting work, and I guess you did a lot of those interviews. I heard more like 100 or something, which is a lot of work in terms of research. And the first thing I was intrigued by, even before I started with the book, was the concept of lifelong learning has been resonating a long time in academia. All the universities love to think of our students coming back again for additional training when their situation changes or when the professional, their industry evolves or something like that. So. The first interesting detail I found about your book is the fact that you reverse the typical term long life learning and you use lifelong learning and you use long life learning. What are your reasons for that change?
Yeah, so precisely that challenge of we all intuitively agree with this concept of lifelong learning, right? We talk about it all the time. It's decades old. It's not something new. But what I always found fascinating whenever I would attend different conferences is that you would get a bunch of different presidents and provosts and academic officers around a table, and they would all be agreeing to how important it is for us all to become lifelong learners. But then I was seeing zero action. It didn't change anything about the systems and the architecture and the infrastructure we were building to actually continuously return to learning. And I think part of our mental space tends to think, well, lifelong learning is great for someone who is maybe close to retirement, finally has worked a long work life, and now can suddenly pursue their passions. There's that kind of idea of lifelong learning where it's self-guided, self-disciplined, learning on your own, pursuing a passion project. There's another kind of lifelong learning that we think, oh yes, we believe in lifelong learning, but for those people over there. I've got a degree, I've got a great job, I don't necessarily need to worry about lifelong learning. The reason why I wanted to switch over to this concept of long life learning is that for me, it was a really helpful mental model to kind of jumpstart us out of this sort of inertia and this kind of stupor where we felt paralyzed to do anything. And I think what happens is when you suddenly hear something like that the first people to live to be 150 years old have already been born, it suddenly makes us have to kind of snap out of it and think, wait a second. So even if I do have a degree or a very fulfilling career, that's not going to be enough. I am going to have to constantly return to learning to make a 60, 80, 100-year work life work for me, right? And I think that's the thing, even though it sounds crazy, but these are things that futurists and experts on aging and longevity are talking about. When you actually take a look at our workforce today, in the US in particular, people are staying in the workforce for far longer than they had ever anticipated. They are staying into their 60s, their 70s. And then the folks who are retiring, it's not like they have had those careers 40 years in one place. They've actually experienced 12 job changes by the time they retire. So when we just sort of slightly extend the idea that we might live longer, which we all, and that we might work longer, which we are already doing, it's not that crazy for us to think that we're going to have to do this 20 or 30 more times in the future to change our jobs. And when you watch that video of the learners themselves talking about how hard it is just to do one job change, how in the world are we going to do this over and over again? So that's really kind of the motivation for writing the book.
Interesting. So, I mean, I found it interesting because after all, I mean, you have a very interesting career. You started with a degree in English and you got your tenure and all that. I started as a biologist, believe it or not. I mean, my original degree was in biology, and I worked in a genetics department. But both you and I, we made significant shifts in our career. I mean, you started to do something completely different. I started to work with computers, and then I started as a software teacher in a business school, and here I am. I got my PhD in a totally different area. But you seem to focus your research in adults that for many different reasons, they seem to have been left behind or left on the sides of the job market with less and less opportunities due to this lack of formal education. In your case or my case, we already had our degrees hanging on the wall, looking very nice, and we could think of a career change, a career shift. But for them, it's kind of different. Do you see the current university system like completely unable to accommodate the needs of such adults, or?
Not completely unable. It's just that our systems were set up for a younger learner who could immerse themselves full-time in learning. And now when we think about that longer work life that we somehow have to reskill and upskill over time, and you use that older structure that was meant for those full-time learners, suddenly when you're dealing with someone who is 45 years old, has 15, 20 years of experience, but no degree, they have to somehow figure out, how do I upskill without starting from scratch? And our systems are built so that these adult learners who have a lot of skills and experiences to bring to the table have to start from scratch, right? We're not truly meeting them where they are. We're not saying, oh, you used to take care of a child with a mental disability. You have these sorts of skills. Or you were a caregiver for someone with Alzheimer's. You actually have these sorts of skills. Or when you were driving a truck across the country thousands of times, you built up these other kinds of skills. We're not helping them sort of understand what those skills are to then say, really, you're actually, 60% of the way there towards going in this direction to be a systems network analyst, right? Or you're 80% of the way there towards being a human resource manager. You and I have gone through so many different job changes, but were they easy? Not at all, right? And we're technically skilled if we have a degree, but having a degree even doesn't necessarily prepare you to make those kinds of changes. And again, that's why my concern is so heavily focused on the people who are being left behind. I wrote this book actually prior to the pandemic. And at that time, there were so many different conversations about the future of work. And what I was worried about is if we want to build toward the future of work, we need to figure out what to do with our present situation where we are already leaving behind so many people. We're so worried about automation, AI taking away our jobs. Mm-hmm. We didn't realize that we already had 41 million Americans in the US who were already being left behind. So if we already have that challenge, what in the world are we going to do as we try to upskill and move forward? And then the pandemic just brought that all front and center, where we realized we have no good way to help skilled folks actually port or transfer their skills that they have today into something new, right? When retail and hospitality just completely came to a stop, we had no way of saying, you've been in customer service over here. There's actually an in-demand opportunity over here in a totally different industry that you would be well prepared to sort of just add a few skills and you're there, right? We just don't have those mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So it's that kind of concern that I have about the people who are being left behind, how hard it is to make just a single transition.
Mm-hmm. So I guess it's something that it doesn't necessarily happen to people with, let's say, a certain subset of the market with low skills or perhaps no formal degrees. It's something that can happen to anyone. Is this related to ageism? I mean, age discrimination. The job market tends to prefer younger workers, perhaps cheaper in that regard, instead of people with more experience, etc., but that tend to be or they could be more expensive sometimes.
Yep. And not only that, not only do employers tend to want the cheaper, younger labor, but we also prefer to hire machines over people, right? Humans are messy, so we'd rather have some sort of automated version of what is going on. But I think those conversations about the future of work have really sort of switched over from preparing us with the right, science, technology, engineering, mathematical skills. There was a conversation about that, how we just didn't have enough of those degrees to match this future of work. And then suddenly you saw that the conversation was actually changing to, we really need to figure out what are our unique competitive advantages as humans so that we can keep our jobs or that we can coordinate better with those machines and computers. So you've seen this kind of this narrative come into light, but it's really both. We have to have both those human and technical skills to survive in the future. One or the other is not really going to do us any good. So I think that's something that we need to just sort of consider.
I totally agree. I mean, in fact, in my institution, what we think is that we need to focus on humanities because these are the things that machines will not be able to replace. Of course, you need a solid training, STEM and all that, but humanities are the things that differentiates us from the machines. So what are the changes that you would be like urging or asking the educational institutions, the universities? Because as I said, I've been 31 years in the academia, although many people, most of my readers, etc., contend that I'm not a conventional academic. I'm more like in touch with the industries, with the companies out there. But I feel like you're asking something from us, from educational institutions. What are these changes that you think are important to start thinking about?
Absolutely. Yeah, if I could maybe show slide 3 here, I think it might be helpful to kind of help us visualize the work ahead. We tend to kind of accept this idea of a T-shaped learner. So if we go to, slide number 3. So this idea, right, that as we think about being prepared well for the workforce, we need T-shaped workers and learners who have that broad, generalist, those human skills, and then some sort of vertical, technical or technological expertise, right? That's kind of been a fashionable idea since the early 90s when this idea of the T-shaped learner came about. If we just go to the next slide, number 4, if we think about translating this into a longer work life, even that idea of a T-shaped learner is not going to be sufficient for the future, because at some points in our career, we are going to have to broaden our skills and build up those managerial, those quote unquote soft skills. Soft skills are very hard to acquire. It's not easy to teach empathy, emotional intelligence, right? You can't learn it in 6 weeks and suddenly become emotionally intelligent. It's a little bit easier to do a boot camp in SQL or cloud computing or machine learning, right? Giving us just that little bit of vertical expertise. Sometimes we're going to have real depth of expertise in a certain area. So the call to action here for our universities and our colleges is to look at this picture and say, how are we actually set up to be that infrastructure of lifelong learning for our adults? Because right now what happens, and that video explains it better than I could ever do, what we do is we make learners force fit their very difficult lives into a very linear system. It's that sort of idea of the square peg in a round hole. We try to make them force whatever they have going on in their lives to whatever structure we have built. But as we think about, again, trying to truly meet learners where they are, how are we going to build this system that gives them exactly what they need at the right time without making them quit their job, right? How can they do this at the same time as raising a family or an elder and trying to work part-time or full-time, right? How do we do this all at the same time? When we really think about it this way, how are we also granting credit to our learners for all the different kinds of assets and capabilities they bring to the table? We don't do this well, right? Our structures are very rigid. They're very brittle. We do not create on and off ramps in and out of learning and work for our learners to be able to do this. So this is truly the call to action here.
Is this also related to the way we learn? I mean, I keep thinking that we are right now in the after Google, in the AG era, not in the BG era. So the BG versus the AG, they are very, very different. In the before Google era, we were memorizing everything, and once you were able to, in theory, able to memorize everything, you were trying to pass an exam. Okay? And this obsession with the exam and the qualification and the credits that you get once you pass the exam were pretty much the way we were learning. Now apparently it's different because, well, in the AG era, whenever we need some specific piece of knowledge, we just Google it and we have it ready at our fingertips. Does this signal that we should change the way we learn or the way we actually teach?
Exactly. Like if we think about the fact that everything we need to know is at our fingertips in our cell phones, right, in our smartphones, the idea that somehow we are conveyors of material and conveyors of content just no longer makes sense for learners who are thinking about spending thousands and thousands of dollars to invest in their education, right? And so the idea that content is no longer proprietary is huge. Google makes it so easy for us, or YouTube, right? The amount of things we learn how to do via YouTube. Suddenly we have to think about, okay, so if content is everywhere, what is it that is our unique advantage as a university or as a college? What is our program truly doing other than disseminating content? And it's really about this idea of applying our knowledge into a specific real world context, being able to be launched into any sort of ambiguous circumstance and exercise judgment, know how to synthesize information, know how to take a concept from a seemingly unrelated domain and make it a part of your solution for this particular problem you're going through. So that idea of kind of problem-based learning has to become just a more significant part of our curriculum instead of, when you're in your final year of university, then you'll maybe take this one course where it's a capstone experience where you have this kind of problem-based learning going on. No, it has to be across the entire system. Every course has to be about that application of knowledge. Because when we think about the people that we engage with every day or the people that we hire, I'm sure you've hired people who sometimes just want to be told exactly what to do and they will do it, right? But those are not the workers we need for the future. We need someone to be thrust into just a truly confusing situation, make sense of it, observe, use their systems thinking capabilities, and get to work, right? We need that ability to just sort of deal with these very ambiguous circumstances. So I think if we go in with that lens of how do we truly cultivate the best problem solvers in the world, it forces us to look very critically at our existing curriculum and say, this will not do.
Very interesting. So going back to Google or to their human resources practices, you know that they don't even call those practices human resources because they think humans are not resources. So they call them in a different way. I remember a particular person, Laszlo Bock. He used to be at Google, and he wrote a very influential article back in 2013. I remember saying that they were at Google trying to see the correlation between the grades that people got in their education and their professional performance, and they ended up with a very clear conclusion. There was no correlation. So they started to figure out, they tried to figure out other ways to hire people, paying attention to other things than the grades. In the beginning, some years ago, if you wanted to work at Google, you would have to have very good grades all over your education, etc. After a while, they said, forget it. We are not looking for that. Is this signaling the same type of problem that you outline in your book?
It does. I mean, I think when you think about IT fields, it's always a little bit easier to do performance-based assessments, right? Because you need someone who can code or who can do statistics or who knows how to sort of do these technical skills. What I think is fascinating about the Google experiment is that in their interview process, to move away from thinking about grades or transcripts or where you went to college. What they are doing is having people literally solve a problem in front of them, right? There have been many books written about the Google interview process and how hard it is to get through. And when you read those books, you realize what they're doing is they want to see how your mind works, how it thinks, how it can kind of take something that you have no idea how to answer necessarily, but start to figure out how might I scaffold a way to get to an answer, right? And that's what we're really trying to cultivate when we're cultivating those problem solvers is how do you teach someone how to think on their feet? Now, granted, I think one of the hard parts, right, about thinking about us as problem solvers is that human element of emotional intelligence, right? That EQ, empathy, all those kind of collaborative teamwork skills that we need to demonstrate in order to be a great colleague and coworker. Those are a little bit harder to assess in an interview process, but you see actually really interesting technological innovations occurring in the AR and VR space where you can be put into a simulation and you're put into a specific situation where you have an employee who's really mad at you and you have to react, right? You have to have a conversation with them and give them feedback or whatever the case may be, or negotiate with them. And now you can do it through these different kinds of scenario-based environments. And that's really exciting too, right? Because it gets at those harder to name skills. Like we talk about communication, we talk about collaboration, teamwork. All of that sounds so good, but it's so broad that it's not very helpful when we're hiring, right? How do we know in advance that this person is going to be a great teammate? We need those kinds of mechanisms. And that's where I think technology is exciting to kind of think about how we also practice those skills as humans.
So I saw in your book that you also ask for changes, not just to the universities, you also ask for changes in the employers, the way they select or they hire people. So it's to that extent, is Google like one step ahead, or are other companies more like advanced in that regard? When I see, for instance, ads from coming from Amazon that says that their hiring process is highly unconventional, and they can, for instance, hire someone and keep training that person on the job, etc., to offer him or her a more like motivating career. Are some companies like one step ahead of what you describe in your book?
Certainly. I think there are a handful of major employers and enterprises who have said, we are going to stop using the degree as our filter for hiring people. Because ultimately, when you do that in the United States, what happens when you use the bachelor's degree as a way to sift through thousands of candidates and maybe get to 100 is that ultimately those 100 end up looking like more men and more white men. Right? So you lose out on the diversity of a pipeline of people who could actually do the job. They just may not have that formal credential. And so a lot of the language you hear over here is around skills-based hiring, right? How do we move away from the degree as a proxy for talent and really think about skills-based hiring? How do we let someone prove that they can do the work ahead instead of using that degree as a hurdle? I think that's really exciting. The one thing I would just sort of say in regards to skills-based hiring is part of it is a linguistic challenge. It's a linguistic barrier that we have between job seekers, educators, and employers. So we, in this kind of three-legged stool, we have three very different languages to talk about the same skills. And that's part of the translation error that occurs when a job seeker is trying to get a job over here with this employer. The employer wants to see some sort of demonstration that maybe our education doesn't necessarily reflect, even though we may have built some of those skills. So part of it is translation error. And the other piece of this is that hiring managers, even though they say they would like to hire someone based on skills instead of degree, we don't actually see that happening at scale. The percentage of people who are still hiring people with the degrees, it's still so dramatically geared towards that direction. We have not yet moved towards behaving differently in order to engage in skills-based hiring.
I see. And continuing with that, I guess that you contend that the more algorithms and automation you introduce in the hiring process, the worst in that regard. I mean, you need more like the human touch to be able to spot this type of characteristics. So if you automate it, you tend to lose it. So I guess these big companies who are, in theory, the places where everyone wants to work, your dream job, etc. I see that with my MBAs. A few years ago, they all wanted to work in investment banking. Then it came consulting, and now they all want to work at Google, Amazon, etc. So these companies receive a crazy amount of resumes, and they need to use automated mechanisms to filter through them. So that becomes also part of the problem, I guess. You get sidelined.
Yeah. And that's again where, as we think about that T-shaped learner and with a lot of those little points that we have to acquire over time, sometimes we are just going to have just enough understanding of machine learning to be able to make those recommendations and those interventions, right? When we think about machine learning, what most people don't understand about artificial intelligence is that it has to be trained on existing data, right? In order to make a machine intelligent, it is reading through our past data. And if our past data always hired people with degrees or white men from this particular college, right? It's exactly, it's embedded in there. So you need humans to be able to look at the results and sort of analyze and ask the hard questions and to make those interventions. And so sometimes, again, it's a little bit of shallow expertise, just knowing enough to be dangerous. Other times it's real depth of expertise. But in the book, I talk about this wonderful 1% initiative that happens in Finland, where they're just trying to teach 1% of their entire population the basic principles around artificial intelligence, right? Because it's everywhere. It's in everything that we do. We just don't know that that's artificial intelligence helping us or ushering us or recommending something to us on Netflix or wherever we are, right? All of that is happening behind the scenes, and it's in this kind of black box. How do we make it more transparent for our learners, our people, so that when we're thinking about legal challenges, right, that we can engage as citizens? We all need that kind of basic understanding of these very interesting concepts.
It's nice to hear you mentioning that course, because I found it really good. I actually recommended it to my students to check it out, because it's open for everyone. You don't need to be finished to take the course. So I was wondering, is this a problem with isomorphism? I mean, universities tend to resemble more and more other universities, and we all tend to resemble our normative environment, so to speak. So is this a problem of professors and universities looking too much at our belly button and trying to do all the same type of things, more publications, more publish or perish, tenure, etc., and losing touch with the reality of the job that we really have to do?
I think, when we think about the distribution of different kinds of colleges and universities, there's always going to be a need for research institutions, right? We need truly engaged faculty members who are engaged in research, who are pushing fields forward, who are helping us advance.
Advancing knowledge.
But not all of us need to be research universities. But our systems are set up to try to want to be, exactly as you say, that isomorphism. We all kind of want to be like Harvard, even though we can't be Harvard, right? And so, but we end up changing our behaviors to move in that direction. Meanwhile, you have millions of learners in the case that I'm talking about, you have 41 million people who are not earning a living wage. They are not thriving in the labor market. They don't care about the research. They care about getting access to the right education that will launch them into a better economic opportunity. So they're not feeling this hustle to survive, right? So when we think about the value proposition of a lifelong learning infrastructure, for some people, it's going to involve research and being at a research university. But for a lot of us, it means we have to figure out, how do we change our behavior? How do we change our systems to meet those 41 million Americans, right? And so I work in academia today. I'm a vice chancellor of strategy and innovation for a large online university system. And even within that area, there's kind of an isomorphism for the leaders in online education. There's like a certain way of doing things, right? But we have to think about this lifelong learning infrastructure as an opportunity to do something quite different. We shouldn't be trying to be like the leaders and trying to catch up. We should actually be moving in a very different direction, catered to the needs of those learners. And that's where I think we can have truly the most impact.
Yeah, because the system is becoming kind of schizophrenia with two different sides. I mean, if you are doing a lot of research, if you're a professor and you're really, really focused on your research, when you teach, you don't even mention your research. Your research is that very deep thing that you have for you, and you only tell that to some scholars in some congresses somewhere. But when you teach totally different things. And in the worst cases, you don't even teach. You ask some teaching assistant to do it for you. So there's a disconnection, there's sort of a disconnection. Is that part of the problem? Is that some symptom of the problem?
Yeah. I mean, our incentives are such that we uphold research, and then teaching kind of comes far below that in general, right? I've had colleagues in the past who have won teaching awards at a university, and their mentors have said, try not to talk about that too much, because it's going to look like you're not a serious scholar, right? So the incentives are not aligned toward the great teaching that we need to facilitate for our learners, right? And we also have to think about, what is our role as faculty members? It is not always going to be the center of the classroom or the center of the online experience. We are not the stage or the source of all knowledge, but we may be more on the side, guiding them along, mentoring them, coaching them, helping them understand how they deploy that knowledge into action, right? It is not always that central figure. That's a hard shift in mindset, right?
It is, because it looks like going against the flow. It looks like your colleagues are going to look at you like, what? It's difficult. So research is obviously important. I mean, you do research, you publish your research, and then perhaps some months or years later, you see that in consulting companies using those models, etc. So it is important, but there seems to be a disconnection between research and teaching in that regard. And I totally agree with what you just said. One more thing, you were focused on your research and interviewing all these people, etc., and with your research question clearly in your mind, and then all of a sudden, boom, March 2020, the pandemic arrives, and we have all this commotion, these huge changes in the market, everywhere. All of a sudden, we were in the middle of a lockdown, people trying to work from home, etc. How did this affected your conclusions or the situation itself, the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a funny thing, because my manuscript for my book was due, and I had just turned it in very close to the time that the pandemic locked us all down.
Wow.
And so I had just turned in this entire manuscript. I thought I was done. And then I took 2 weeks off just to sort of think about, does this mean that I have to rewrite the entire book potentially?
Wow.
Thank goodness it did not mean that. But what it helped was, with all of those conversations about the future of work that sounded so thrilling and exciting and scary and also paralyzing, I realized that one of the hard things when you're talking to people about when you're talking to people about jobs and things that are going to go out of existence, it is overwhelming to think about, 47% of the workforce potentially being out of job because of automation, right? Those kinds of numbers are paralyzing. Or even if it's 36 million people out of a job, what happens when you focus on the things and the jobs is it takes away that sense of being able to move toward action. And so for me, it just became clearer how important it is to shift the conversation from the future of work to the future of workers. And that was really my attempt here, right? To bring people, the human side of this to life, to understand that all of the challenges and barriers that these people are facing, the people in the video, the 41 million Americans are facing, are the same exact challenges that we are all going to face. If we don't fix this now, and we saw how incredibly stuck our economy was because we don't know how to transition millions of people into better opportunities. If we can't figure this out, we're all actually, even if we have that great job today, we are all going to run into the same exact barriers and challenges. So we need to solve for it now. So what the pandemic did for me was actually it helped me because it brought that sense of urgency to, I was trying to show how there was this big problem over here with 41 million people being left behind. I didn't have to do that anymore because all of a sudden I had an extra 40 million people who were out of work, right? Who couldn't figure out a way to move forward. And so that means that our current systems, our education and workforce systems and training systems are not functioning, right? We knew that there were always these cracks in the system. Now they had just been brought to full light. So in many ways, it helped the cause.
Helped the message to be transmitted. On the other hand, the pandemic meant a very interesting thing. Many people started to figure out the technologies that they could use, for instance, to keep up with their studies or to keep working. I remember, I don't know, a couple of years ago, if you wanted to do a video conference, you were like panicking. Oh my God, video conferencing, this is very difficult, and let's call IT and have someone from IT really close in case something malfunctions or I lose the sound or the camera or something. Right now, we all video conference like this. It's like extremely straightforward. So we have a number of people who were not able to use these methodologies, these communication methodologies, etc. And now they pretty much anyone can do it. Better or worse, but anyone can use it. In some cases, the result was not great. I would probably contend that in education, in many cases, many of the classes were terribly boring, and there was not too much innovation in that regard. But what do you think? I mean, have we created an opportunity via technology to these people that perhaps they want to receive additional education, additional training? They were not able to do it by attending traditional universities in the traditional sense, going to a classroom, sitting in a classroom, etc. And perhaps now they would be able to do it from the comfort of their houses using these technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we did when we moved online or to Zoom or whatever interface we were using for our learners, right? Suddenly we were able to kind of move away from the stigma of online learning that somehow online learning is inferior to in-person learning. Exactly. At the same time, however, right, as you talk about, the quality of our online learning experiences, because we were just thrust into the situation, the quality was actually quite low, right? We were just kind of trying to do Zoom calls and we are going to see over time, however, that, oh my goodness, this is actually a really interesting avenue to explore. And hopefully more universities will look towards the leaders who've been doing this for decades already to say, what are we learning from them? Because we don't necessarily need to just sort of use a video conference call to convey information. How do we turn that virtual classroom into a flipped classroom experience, right? How do we do all of these things online, right? So that's the challenge. It was both a boon for the system because it moved us so quickly into a new way of doing things. It pulled us away from that stigma. I think the work ahead is really thinking about how we improve and not take that as this is what online learning is. It is not, right? That is not what we should be looking towards. The other piece of this that I would just sort of say is when we look at the digital transformation that everyone has been kind of forced, that's a perfect kind of example of how the pandemic has shown us the areas that we need to build solutions in, right? the fact that we were able to move toward digital transformation in so many companies and employers is a great thing. But we don't actually have structures set up in colleges and universities to teach these kinds of skills. How do you lead a company through a digital transformation instead of just being forced into one, right? So if we look at the things that kind of came out of the pandemic, we can actually start building there. When we look at how today our supply chain is kind of falling apart, right? Because we stopped activity in so many warehouses, and now we're all waiting for a shipment to come that used to take maybe 4 weeks, now takes 16, 20 weeks, right? When we look at these areas in supply chain, logistics, we don't have enough programs to prepare our folks to be able to move into those roles that are so clearly needed in the market. So again, as we look at the lessons of the pandemic, let's look at where we were forced to adjust or switch very quickly, or where things are kind of falling apart, to figure out this is where we actually need to build more learning solutions.
Interesting. One final question. Well, this is a highly international event, but I'm here in Spain, so I'm going to try to use the opportunity to ask you something about the job market here. I don't know if, you probably heard something about Spain, very high unemployment, almost dysfunctional job market, and particularly worrying in very young people. People who leave, finish their degrees, they end their studies at the universities, and they find it really, really difficult to get their first job. And normally the jobs are like very underqualified or totally different from what they were expecting to do. Any advice any advices for Spain based on your research?
Yeah, so we don't have the same rates of unemployment and underemployment for our youth, but we do have very high rates of underemployment in the US, where, as you're mentioning, these folks are graduating and then they're going into a job that never required a college degree in the first place, right? So they're not appropriately employed. And what we found from some of the research that I was able to do with burning glass technologies is we were able to see that for most newly minted graduates of college, 43% of them were starting off their careers underemployed. So they were not in that college level job. And that was sort of pretty much aligned with a lot of the other data we were seeing out of the Federal Reserve. But what was fascinating was once you started off your career underemployed, you stayed underemployed. You were 5 times more likely to stay underemployed 5 years out. And 75% of that group stayed underemployed 10 years out. So the intense ramifications of not being able to build a professional network, right? Not being able to build social capital, not being able to build wealth, right? Accumulate wealth over time. It's really, really problematic for our learners and so our workers. And so one of the things that we talked about in our conversation is the same challenge. We have to pull that degree requirement out of the way, right? In order to widen the pipeline of folks who can prove that they can do this job. We also have to start taking away the number of years of experience we expect for frontline work, right? We can't say to someone, you have to already have 3 years of experience who's only 20 years old, right? It's
impossible.
How are they supposed to?
It's tautologically impossible.
Or on the university side, we need to figure out how to embed more work-based learning experiences, right? And there are these different kinds of micro internship sites or gig work where people can start to do small tasks for companies to prove that they have some work experience. So it kind of goes both ways. Employers need to kind of let go of all of those requirements that stand as barriers. And then on the education side, we need to be helping our learners translate very quickly their skills into the language of the labor market. Or if we find out, for instance, that if someone's going into journalism is not just about writing really well. It's about data visualization. It's about Google Analytics and search engine optimization. We need to help them acquire those skills while they're with us learning so that they can just make a smoother transition and signal to a potential employer and say, I already have the skills you're looking for. So it kind of goes both ways. But it's a really worrisome problem, but there are ways in which we can actually build some solutions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I will be talking to you for hours, for sure. It's been a real pleasure, but we are out of time. So thanks a lot for all your Well, thanks first of all for the book, and then for all the very nice talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.